Hey everyone, welcome to JD Power's Technology Support Podcast. I'm Michael Vermillion with JD Power, and with me today are Mark Miller from JD Power, and we also have Greg Dickerson and Mike Noeth with us today. So Mark, Greg, Mike, welcome.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike. Great to be here.
Topic for today's podcast, and we're going to do a couple of these going forward, is that we here at JD Power have worked to develop a maturity model for the technical support organization. And the way to think about this is that every organization is in a different place when it comes to maturity. We have it organized in terms of 4 different states, ranging from an organization where there's really kind of no process or planning, all the way to an organization that is hitting every mark in terms of best practices. So that's kind of the range of the maturity. And then we've got it broken into 4 different buckets or categories labeled primary, people, process, and technology. So today we want to hit on the process bucket in terms of the maturity model for technical support organizations. So Mike Noeth, how are we thinking about the maturity of technical support organizations when it comes to process?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And so as you mentioned, the organizations are at different levels of maturity. But one of the things we look at is the whole category around the support channels and what processes are in place there, and what are the channels and how are those channels connected. So kind of from left to right across your screen, organizations that are early in the game and kind of informal and somewhat primitive, they may have 1 or 2 channels that aren't necessarily connected. And on the far right, if you will, what we talk about is omni-channel, where all of those channels are connected. So here's an example of that. You might start a chat session with a support engineer, and it might become apparent that this needs to progress to a broader assisted case where you need to get on the phone with one another, perhaps. If you do that, then the chat transcript would be preserved so that you didn't have to start from scratch with perhaps a different support engineer. And then in the middle are the various phases. But we're just looking at how the organizations have, again, in the context of processes around support channels, how they offer those channels to the customers, how the customers are able to choose their channel of choice, and then how those channels connect with one another. Greg, you might have more to add on that.
Absolutely, Mike. One of the things that we've observed in the recent past is there's a weakness there in terms of transparency across these channels, where you don't necessarily see when it comes to CSAT and it comes to the financial impact. Your front lines don't necessarily see everything, and therefore they're kind of handicapped in that area when they're engaged with those customers. So, there was a real recent example where a specific client that we worked with demonstrated through their survey results how they actually identified anything that came about through these results, and they were actually able to make improvements that allowed the channels to actually work the way the channels should be working, and they were seeing solid results because of that.
Another thing I would say too is that one of the many channels that we often see, and some customers or clients are more along the road, if you will, on this one, is the whole self-service aspect. And that's all about providing information to customers so they can solve their own issue. And there's a lot of process that's necessary with respect to that as well. How is information created, and how is it provided? How is it found? How is it stored? How is it updated? And sometimes we see there's a ton of information, but finding it and keeping it current are maybe a different story, if you will. So again, it goes back to the processes around enabling customers to get their answers the way that best suits them. And all of this process, of course, is in the context of not becoming the work, but rather being there to support the work.
You're absolutely right, Mike. When it comes to self-service, the front lines need to be the educators. They need to be teaching the customers how to help themselves so that, in their capacity, they can then in turn, focus on the complex, the tough problems that come about. And we don't see enough of that. And, the instances where, you have a robust self-service portal for your customers, but it's not really speaking their language. And that's one of the areas that we see that, progressive companies will look at and say, how do we make this really interactive with our customers and make it useful for them so that they don't, experience that level of frustration of not being able to find what they're looking for, and then consequently end up opening an assisted case, which takes more time, more resources, and adds to the level of frustration with the customer.
So we talked about self-service. We talked about enabling the front line to train the customers. Where else do we see companies struggling a bit in terms of process, just in terms of advancing from kind of where they are today to what we would view as best practice?
Absolutely, Mike. Another area we look at is quality and how that the quality program is being handled within a support organization. Companies that do this very well have standards and they have specific expectations for QA. They look at both the technical and process related aspects of the case. In addition to that, they look to conduct regular calibration sessions to make sure that there is a consistent interaction, no matter which individual in the front lines is engaging with their customers and how they're engaging, as we alluded to with the variety of channels available. And we've seen both ends of the spectrum. Companies that only look at the technical aspect of a interaction, and others that focus in on the soft skills. They look at the email communications, the meeting follow-up commitments, things of that nature, and they don't really look at, okay, well, did they provide the right solution? So both sides of this coin are very, very important. It's essential to have a quality program that truly addresses both.
Yeah, I'd jump in here real quick. Greg and Mike, in our experience with top performers, there's a wide variance between them and others in terms of sustainability. In your experience in being out in the field with a variety of client performers, would you agree that many organizations on a flow chart have a process, but not all organizations who have a process actually consistently follow it? And in addition, they don't consistently follow it when they get call spikes or case spikes, right? Which oftentimes on the surface sounds really good. Like, hey, we got to meet our service levels, which we're, of course, at JD Power, all for meeting service levels. But once you start going down the path of giving up some of these QA elements, as an example, and then coaching behind it and developing behind it in pursuit of short-term, chasing a service level, you can actually create kind of a mini runaway effect that gets out of control very quickly. So would you all have any comments on that notion of consistently applying the processes? QA is a good example, but other processes around coaching and development as being a key that top performers do consistently versus those who might not.
Yeah, I would certainly support that, Mark. I mean, for example, when we go in and look at support organizations and we ask to have processes shown to us and demonstrated, and then we look for evidence that they're actually being lived by, to your point, because otherwise it's just some document that somebody created and doesn't follow. So case in point, back to quality of work. Look at case management. we like to see consistency around how is a case opened, how is it worked, how is it escalated, how is it closed, how is the customer updated all through that process. And from the outside looking in, that's super important, because otherwise, every time I call you, you look like a different company to me. And then as far as the quality specifically, it's a conscious effort on an organization to measure quality. Everybody can measure quantity. How many cases do we take? How many did we close today? How fast did we do it? But how well do we do it is where this quality work comes into play. And it's super important that organizations take a look at a sample size of their cases. And as Greg said, making sure that we've got technical accuracy, we've got soft skills in place, we're using the right tools, we're implementing the processes which we say we have, to your point. It's all very important along the way, and it's what differentiates really good service organizations from others that are just there.
Yeah, what's interesting is that, and this is kind of a quasi plug for our what we offer. We've got over 300 best practices, and when folks self-score, they do better than when we score them, right? Because the proof is in the pudding all the way down through the org. So it's just not the existence of, but it's the execution of. So a tip for everybody as you start thinking about process, go beyond the review of the process in the flow charts and go beyond meeting with executives who have responsibility for executing the processes, but go all the way down through the front line, because that's where you're going to see those misses. Wouldn't you guys agree with that assessment?
Absolutely, Mark. And I think the other thing is that it's looking at even further when you do a comparison of companies that do things and do things well. They look at quality, as an example, as a means to coach and develop their people, not as a means to performance manage them. And that's one of the biggest differentials is really using that quality, whether you have frontline supervisors doing the quality work or whether you have a separate team, using that as a means to really develop your people and help them to grow in their role and become better is the key.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. When we look just across all industries and actually across disciplines within orgs, so this goes beyond technology support, though it's certainly applicable, and frankly, as much or as more applicable in this case is this notion of incentives and controls. And process is so important. Greg, you just mentioned something that you actually can build on both the notion of incentives and controls or mechanisms that you put in place to ensure that things are met. And then incentives are the motivation behind activating those processes in terms of actions and behaviors. And the best companies gain executional advantage. So moving something from a concept to execution success by paying strict attention all the way through to aligning incentives and controls. And that QA that you just mentioned is among the very best examples of how you can get a force multiplier by measuring certain behaviors that, oh, by the way, are incented against and coached against and rewarded against. When you have those elements in place, you're really able to quickly move the performance needle when they're all aligned. And that's just a great example that you brought up, Greg, of getting out of compliance mode, but getting into behavior mode with your QA programs.
So guys, just to wrap up today's topic, in our framework, outsourcing strategy falls into the process bucket. So what does a great best practice look like for outsourcing strategy? And how does that compare to where most companies are today?
I think what we see is that companies that do it well view their outsourcer as a true partner, someone that shares the same values and goals, not just simply as a means to reduce um, support costs. You know, because you're never going to see what you ultimately are looking for when you make a decision for an outsource partner as utilizing, you know, cost savings, because there are so many hidden costs when you don't have that same level of value and same goals in mind with that partner. So making sure that they are, you know, totally aligned and that you are transparent in your communication um, with them and providing them with the tools necessary to be able to be at the same level as your own internal staff. I mean, I've seen both sides of the equation here. There was one client in particular that I worked with. The first time I worked with them, that they actually wouldn't allow their brand to be displayed in the partner's facility. They didn't want anyone to recognize that they were actually utilizing that partner. That was to the extent that they were not engaged with that partner and they were treating them more as a, you know, a vendor or a supplier. Yet there was another client that I worked with that actually, if you walked up to a member of that outsourced team and asked them who they worked for, they would not identify themselves by the outsourced company that they work for. They identified themselves by the client name and brand because they were so totally embedded with that client and understood their products and understood the passion behind the products that that client was offering.
You know, and what I would say in addition to that is, you know, the companies that really have a solid strategy, they give you a real clear answer on why. You know, sometimes we go in and we talk to clients and we go, "Why are you outsourcing?" And they start telling us about the products and the levels of service, and we're like, "Yeah, but why? You know, what problem are you trying to solve?" And if you're really clear on that, and as Greg says, it's not just about saving cost, but it's providing a certain level of expertise, perhaps in a part of the world or on a product set, or maybe your mature product set, for example, so that you can represent your service organization, your tech support organization, and the partner can represent it as you, so that from the outside looking in, it still looks like the A team. That's what the end game is here. And on the side of those that are not so strong in this area, sometimes they seem to have lost the plot in terms of why they're actually outsourcing. You know, we've kind of always done it, but it's not any longer clear in terms of what are the products, what are the service offerings. Are you only doing level one? Are you only doing the older products so that your engineers can work on newer products? Whatever that strategy is, we like to see some real clear answers to that. And then from a process standpoint, that the partner executes the same way as the prime, if you will, so that again, from the outside looking in, it looks like one single organization.
Those are great insights, and that's going to wrap it up today. Wrap it up for today. So I want to thank Mark, Greg, and Mike for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thanks.
And also want to thank you, our listeners, as well. And we'll see you next time.